Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. Picture this, Westminster Abbey, 1603. A woman dies. They seal her body in lead within hours. 400 years later, that tomb remains locked. Every request to open it denied. What could be inside that coffin that's so dangerous the British monarchy still won't let us look? Tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of the most elaborate performance in history. Because Elizabeth I didn't just rule England, she erased herself to become a myth. And that myth, it slowly killed her. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. The woman inside that golden costume was breaking apart piece by piece, secret by secret, year by year. And it all started on one November day in 1558, when a 25-year-old survivor made a choice that would haunt her for the next 45 years. Before we step into Elizabeth's world together, I want to ask you something. If this story pulls you in, if you find yourself wondering what happened next or feeling something shift inside you, would you consider subscribing to the channel? Hit that like button when it genuinely moves you, not because I asked, but because you want to be part of this journey with me. And hey, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from right now? Your bedroom? Late at night? Maybe you're somewhere across the ocean? Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing there are people out there, all over the world, choosing to spend their time listening to these stories with me. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket. Let's step back in time together. November 17th, 1558. Hatfield House, England. A young woman sits by a tree when a messenger arrives. He kneels before her. "Your Majesty," he says, just 2 words. But in those 2 words, everything changes. Mary Tudor is dead. Elizabeth is queen. Now here's what the paintings and movies don't show you. Elizabeth didn't jump up with joy. She didn't immediately run off to claim her throne. According to witnesses, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she said something in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." Formal, controlled, perfect. Even in that very first moment of becoming queen, Elizabeth was already performing. And you have to understand why. This woman had spent her entire life, all 25 years of it, learning one brutal lesson. Show weakness, and you die. Show emotion, and you die. Show your real self, and you die. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded before Elizabeth's 3rd birthday. Her teenage years were spent dodging execution. At 14, she was caught up in a scandal that could have ended her life. At 21, her own sister locked her in the Tower of London, in the same rooms where their mother had waited for death. Elizabeth walked out of that tower, but something had changed. She'd learned to survive by becoming whatever people needed her to be, obedient when they wanted submission, sick when they needed an excuse not to interrogate her too harshly, silent when speaking would be dangerous. She became a chameleon. But here's the thing about being a chameleon. Eventually you forget what colour you actually are. So when that messenger knelt before her at Hatfield, Elizabeth wasn't just becoming Queen of England. She was making a choice. She was deciding to take that survival skill, that ability to perform, to hide, to be anything except herself, and turn it into a work of art. She was going to create the most elaborate costume in history. She was going to become Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the icon, the myth, and she was never, ever going to take that mask off again. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant. Practically speaking, Elizabeth's coronation was on January 15th, 1559. She rode through London in cloth of gold. The crowds went absolutely wild. They loved her. They'd hated Mary. Bloody Mary, who'd burned Protestants by the hundreds. Elizabeth represented hope, a fresh start, a young, beautiful queen to save England. But here's what those cheering crowds couldn't see. The corset laced so tight Elizabeth could barely breathe, the crown so heavy it gave her headaches. The weight of every single eye on her, judging, evaluating, looking for any sign of weakness. Because remember, she was a woman in 1559, trying to rule a country that had never really had a successful queen before. The pressure started immediately, and I mean immediately. Within weeks of her coronation, the demands began. Your Majesty must marry. That's all anyone talked about. Her council, parliament, foreign ambassadors. Every single one of them looked at this 25-year-old woman and saw the same thing. Incomplete, unfinished, temporary. A woman without a husband was like a sentence without punctuation. It just didn't make sense to them. Marry Philip of Spain, they said. He was her dead sister's widower, twice her age. He wanted to absorb England into his Catholic empire, marry the Archduke of Austria. Protestant, but would mean England tied to the Habsburgs, marry an English nobleman. That would trigger civil war. Every noble family would fight over who deserved to be king. Every single option was a trap. And Elizabeth? She smiled. She said she'd consider it. She played along. But inside she was doing calculations. Cold, hard political math. If she married a foreign prince, England would become a satellite state. If she married an English noble, she'd be dragged into factional warfare. And if she married anyone at all, she'd have to share her power, she'd have to obey, she'd have to submit. Remember, this is a woman who'd watched her father go through 6 wives. She'd seen how disposable queens were, how quickly a beloved wife could become a beheaded traitor. She'd seen it up close and personal. So Elizabeth did something revolutionary. She decided she wouldn't marry at all. Instead, she'd marry England itself. She'd make that her whole identity. The Virgin Queen wedded to her kingdom. It was brilliant, really, political genius. By staying unmarried, she could keep foreign powers guessing. She could string along suitors for years, using marriage negotiations as a diplomatic tool. And she'd never have to give her power to any man. But here's what nobody talks about. What that decision cost her as a human being. Think about it for a second. You're 25 years old. You've just become the most powerful person in your country, and you decide right then and there that you can never have a real relationship. Never show your true feelings, never let your guard down, never be vulnerable, never just be a person. Elizabeth couldn't have casual conversations because everything she said was analysed for political meaning. She couldn't have private friendships because everyone wanted something from her. She couldn't fall in love because love would compromise her power. She couldn't even get sick without it becoming a national crisis. When she caught smallpox at 29 and nearly died, the whole country panicked. Not because they cared about Elizabeth the woman, but because Elizabeth the Queen had no heir. If she died, there'd be civil war. So she learned to never show weakness, never show pain, never show fear. She painted her face white to hide the smallpox scars. She wore elaborate costumes to look larger than life. She controlled every single detail of her image. Every portrait had to be approved. Every public appearance was choreographed. She created this persona of Gloriana, the untouchable, eternal, perfect Virgin Queen. And slowly, year by year, the woman underneath that costume started to disappear. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but wasn't she successful? Didn't she defeat the Spanish Armada? Didn't she preside over a golden age of English culture? Wasn't it worth it? And that's the complicated part. Yes, politically Elizabeth was incredibly successful. England thrived under her rule. But here's what I find heartbreaking. Success and happiness aren't the same thing. You can be brilliant at your job and still be dying inside. You can be admired by millions and still be profoundly lonely. You can be the most powerful woman in the world and still be trapped. because that's what Elizabeth became, trapped inside her own creation. The Virgin Queen persona was supposed to protect her. It was supposed to give her power, but it became a prison. Once she built that image, she couldn't tear it down without everything collapsing. She had to maintain it, feed it, protect it, even when it started eating her alive. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night thinking about her. Elizabeth knew what she was giving up. She wasn't naive. She made this choice with her eyes wide open. There are moments in her letters, rare unguarded moments, where you can see the woman underneath. She wrote about wanting to be seen as a woman and not a goddess. She called her unmarried state my hard estate. When foreign ambassadors would press her about marriage, sometimes she'd snap back with bitter humour. I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, she'd say, namely the Kingdom of England. It sounds triumphant in the history books, but can you hear the sadness in that? The resignation? She's 30, 40, 50 years old telling people she's married to a country. That's not a victory. That's a woman trying to make sense of a choice that's slowly hollowing her out. And the worst part, she couldn't even admit that out loud, because admitting it would mean admitting weakness, and weakness would unravel everything. So she kept performing day after day, year after year, decade after decade. She woke up every morning and put on the costume, the white makeup, the elaborate wigs, the jeweled gowns, the mask of the Virgin Queen, and every night she took it off in private, looked in the mirror, and saw the toll it was taking. But by then, it was too late to stop. The lie had become her life. The performance had become her reality. Elizabeth the person had disappeared so completely into Elizabeth the icon that even she couldn't separate them anymore. And here's the question that haunts me. At what point does a mask stop being a mask? When does a performance become your identity? When does protecting yourself become destroying yourself? Because that's what happened to Elizabeth. The armor she built to survive ended up being the thing that killed her. Slowly, painfully, over 45 years. But it didn't start with her death. It started much, much earlier. The cracks in the mask appeared almost immediately, and the first crack, the one that would set the pattern for everything that followed, happened when Elizabeth was just 14 years old. When a charming, handsome man with political ambitions looked at a vulnerable teenage girl and saw an opportunity. What happened in those morning visits would shape everything about how Elizabeth viewed love, trust, and her own body for the rest of her life. That's where we're going next. To Chelsea Manor, 1547, to morning light slipping under a door, to a young girl waking up to find her stepfather standing at the foot of her bed, smiling, to the scandal that taught Elizabeth Tudor that her body wasn't her own, that showing vulnerability invited violation, that the only safe place was behind a wall so high nobody could ever reach her. You're going to want to hear this part, because it's the secret that started breaking her long before she ever became queen. Stay with me, we're just getting started. Chelsea Manor, London, spring 1547. Picture a house that should have been filled with happiness. The Dowager Queen, Catherine Parr, has finally married the man she loves after years of waiting. Thomas Seymour, handsome, charming, the Lord High Admiral of England, and living with them is Catherine's stepdaughter, 14-year-old Elizabeth, the girl who'd just lost her father, Henry VIII, a few months earlier, a girl still wearing black mourning clothes, a girl who desperately needed safety and stability. Instead, she got Thomas Seymour. Now, here's where I need you to really listen, because what I'm about to tell you is documented in court records. These aren't rumours or gossip, these are sworn testimonies from people who were there. Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, was questioned under threat of execution and wrote down exactly what she witnessed. Thomas Parry, Elizabeth's treasurer, did the same, and Elizabeth herself gave testimony when she was interrogated. So we know what happened, we have the details, and they're disturbing. It started with morning visits. Thomas Seymour would come into Elizabeth's bedroom before she was dressed, before she was even awake sometimes, in his nightgown, and according to Cat Ashley's testimony, he would strike her upon the back or on the buttocks familiarly. He'd pull back her bed curtains and make as though he would come at her. Elizabeth would shrink back into her bed, pulling the covers around her, and he'd laugh, like it was all a game. Cat Ashley tried to stop it. She told Catherine Parr she said this behaviour was unseemly and not appropriate. And you know what Catherine did? She started joining in. She'd come with Thomas on these morning visits. She'd hold Elizabeth down while Thomas cut her black morning dress into hundreds of pieces. They both laughed while Elizabeth stood there, humiliated in her shredded gown. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where the people who are supposed to protect you were the ones hurting you? Where you couldn't speak up because you were powerless? Where the adults in charge told you that your discomfort was funny, that you were being too sensitive, that it was all just harmless fun? That's where 14-year-old Elizabeth was, and she had nowhere to go. She couldn't leave. Catherine was her legal guardian. She couldn't complain. Thomas was the Lord High Admiral, one of the most powerful men in England. She couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe her over them? So she did the only thing she could do. She adapted. She started getting up before dawn, getting fully dressed before anyone could come in. She surrounded herself with her ladies-in-waiting at all times. She became hyper-vigilant, always on guard, always prepared. Sound familiar? It's exactly what she'd do later as queen, always performing, always protected, never vulnerable. It's almost like this is where she learned it. But here's where it gets darker. Summer of 1548. Catherine Parr is pregnant. She's finally going to have the child she has wanted her whole life. She should be happy, but something's wrong. According to witnesses, Catherine caught Thomas and Elizabeth in what the records call an embrace. Exactly what that means, we'll never know for sure. But it was enough that Catherine, who'd been laughing along with Thomas's games for over a year, suddenly wasn't laughing anymore. Elizabeth was sent away, immediately, to a different house in Hertfordshire, and if you read between the lines of the historical accounts, you can see what everyone was thinking but not saying out loud. Was Elizabeth pregnant? There are records of her being mysteriously ill for several weeks after leaving Chelsea. She stayed in bed. She refused to see anyone. And then, suddenly, she was fine again. What happened during these weeks? We don't know. The records are conveniently vague, but the whispers followed her for years afterward. On September 5th, 1548, Catherine Parr died. She'd given birth to a daughter 6 days earlier. Puerperal fever, they said, a common cause of death after childbirth back then. But Catherine's last words to Thomas were chilling. According to witnesses, she said, "My lord, I would have given 1,000 marks to have had my full talk with my doctor the first day I was delivered, but I durst not for displeasing you." Translation: I wanted to see my doctor, but I was afraid of making you angry. What was Catherine afraid of? Why couldn't she see her own physician? Some historians think Catherine had finally realised what kind of man she'd married. That maybe in those last days she understood what he'd done to Elizabeth, what he was capable of. And it broke her heart. Thomas Seymour's reaction to his wife's death. Within weeks he was trying to arrange a marriage with Elizabeth. This 15-year-old girl he'd been harassing for over a year. He sent letters. He sent proposals through intermediaries, and when those didn't work, he did something incredibly stupid. In January 1549, he tried to break into King Edward's bedroom at Hampton Court Palace with a loaded pistol. His precise plan isn't clear. Maybe he was trying to kidnap the young king, maybe something worse. But he was caught, arrested, sent to the Tower of London, And then the interrogations began. Everyone connected to Thomas Seymour was questioned. His servants, his associates, and Elizabeth. They came for her in her house at Hatfield, showed up with armed guards, demanded answers. Had she conspired with Thomas? Had they planned to marry? Had they been intimate? Was she carrying his child? Elizabeth was 15 years old, and she was being interrogated for treason. Now this is where you see the incredible intelligence of this young woman. She didn't panic. She didn't break down crying. She didn't confess to things she hadn't done just to make them stop asking questions. Instead, she gave them nothing. She answered every question carefully. Yes, Thomas had proposed marriage. No, she hadn't accepted. She would only marry with the council's permission. She acknowledged the morning visits, but described them as innocent teasing. She denied everything that could be used against her. Her governess, Cat Ashley, under intense pressure, admitted more details about Thomas's behaviour. Thomas Parry, terrified of execution, gave a fuller account, but Elizabeth, she stuck to her story. Calm, controlled, giving them just enough truth to seem honest, but never enough to condemn herself. And here's what absolutely kills me about this. She was protecting Thomas Seymour, the man who'd harassed her, the man who'd violated her boundaries repeatedly, the man who'd made her teenage years a nightmare. She could have destroyed him with her testimony. One word from the princess, and he'd have been dead for sure. But she didn't. She kept her answers careful and measured. Why? Maybe because she understood that if she admitted what really happened, she'd be ruined too. In Tudor England, even if you were the victim, even if you were a child, if there was any hint of sexual impropriety, your reputation was destroyed. Elizabeth had already been declared illegitimate after her mother's execution. She'd already been removed from the line of succession once. Another scandal could end any hope she had of ever becoming queen, so she lied. Or rather, she told a version of the truth so carefully edited that it protected everyone except herself. She took all that trauma, all that violation, all that humiliation, and she swallowed it down, locked it away, pretended it didn't matter. Thomas Seymour was executed on March 20th, 1549. They didn't even give him a trial. They passed an act of attainder and beheaded him. Elizabeth's reaction to his death. According to one account, when she heard the news, she said, "This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment." That's it. That's all she said publicly. No tears, no trauma, just a calm, measured observation. The mask was already firmly in place. At 15 years old, Elizabeth Tudor had learned the most important lesson of her life. Your body isn't your own, your feelings don't matter, and survival means never, ever showing what's really happening inside you. Think about how that shaped everything that came after. When her counsel begged her to marry, she saw marriage as surrendering control of her body again. When suitors courted her, she kept them at arm's length, always. When Robert Dudley, the man she probably actually loved, got too close, she pulled away. Because getting close meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant danger. The Thomas Seymour scandal taught Elizabeth that her body was a political tool, not something that belonged to her, that showing affection invited violation, that the people you trusted could hurt you the most, that even when you're the victim, you'll be blamed, that the only way to stay safe is to stay distant, controlled, untouchable. No wonder she became the Virgin Queen. Virgin didn't just mean unmarried, it meant unreachable, untouchable, protected by walls so high that no one could ever hurt her again. The costume she built as queen wasn't just about political power, it was armor, protection against ever being that vulnerable 14-year-old girl again, waking up to find a man standing over her bed. And here's the cruelest irony. The very thing that kept her safe, That emotional distance, that refusal to be vulnerable, that carefully controlled image, was the same thing that would eventually destroy her. Because you can't lock away part of yourself without locking away all of yourself. You can't wall off the pain without also walling off the joy. You can't refuse intimacy forever without becoming profoundly, devastatingly lonely. But Elizabeth didn't know that yet. At 15, she just knew she'd survived. She'd walked through fire and come out the other side. She'd been interrogated for treason and walked away free. She'd learned how to lie, how to perform, how to hide. And she thought those were strengths. She thought she'd won. She didn't realize she'd just built the first brick in the prison that would hold her for the rest of her life. But the walls weren't complete yet. There was still a crack, still one person who could reach her, one person who made her feel things she'd sworn never to feel again. His name was Robert Dudley. They'd known each other since childhood. They'd both been prisoners in the Tower at the same time. They understood each other in a way no one else did. And when Elizabeth became queen, Robert became her master of horse, which meant he saw her every single day, and slowly, carefully, despite all her walls and armor and carefully constructed defenses, she fell in love with him. It should have been a happy story. The Queen and her childhood friend finally together. But nothing in Elizabeth's life was ever that simple, because Robert Dudley had a wife. Her name was Amy, and on September 8th, 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. The circumstances were suspicious. The scandal was enormous. And Elizabeth's chance at happiness died right along with Amy's body. Let me tell you about the day Elizabeth's heart broke, and how a death she had nothing to do with became the secret that destroyed her last chance at having a real life. Stay with me. This is where it gets truly heartbreaking. September 8th, 1560, a Sunday. Amy Robsart woke up that morning in a house called Cumnor Place, about 60 miles from London. She was 28 years old. She'd been married to Robert Dudley for 10 years, but she'd barely seen him in the last 2. He was always at court, always with the Queen. Everyone in England knew why, and Amy knew it too. Here's what we know for certain about that day. Amy insisted that every single person in the household, all the servants, all her ladies-in-waiting, everyone, go to the fair in Abingdon. It was Our Lady's Fair, a big event, but Amy didn't want to go. She wanted to stay home, alone. And when one of her companions, a Mrs. Oddingsells, said she didn't feel like going to the fair either, Amy practically forced her out the door. Go, she said, I want the house empty. Mrs. Oddingsells thought this was strange, deeply strange. Ladies of Amy's rank didn't stay home alone. It wasn't proper. It wasn't safe. But Amy was insistent. So they went. All of them. They left Amy Robsart alone in that big, quiet house. When they came back that evening, they found her at the bottom of a short flight of stairs. Her neck was broken. She was dead. Now, before I go any further, let me tell you about the coroner's report. For 450 years, this report was lost. Historians searched for it. Nothing. Then, in 2008, a researcher named Dr. Stephen Gunn was going through documents at the National Archives in London, and there it was. The actual inquest from 1560, and what it revealed was shocking. Amy Robsart had 2 wounds on her head, 2 distinct injuries, deep enough to cause serious trauma. But here's the strange part. There were no other injuries. If someone falls down a flight of stairs, you'd expect bruises, scrapes, maybe broken bones in the hands or arms from trying to catch yourself. Amy had none of that. Just 2 head wounds and a broken neck. The jury at the time, 15 local men who examined her body, ruled it death by misadventure, an accident. But honestly, that ruling raises more questions than it answers. Because how do you fall downstairs in a way that gives you 2 precise head wounds and nothing else? Let me walk you through the 3 theories that have haunted historians for centuries. Because here's the thing, no matter which one is true, it destroyed Elizabeth. Theory 1, accident. Maybe Amy had been sick. There are reports from the Spanish ambassador, foreign spies were watching this situation closely, that Amy had a malady in one of her breasts. Historians think this means breast cancer. Advanced breast cancer can spread to the bones, make them brittle. Some medical experts have suggested she might have had a spontaneous vertebral fracture. Her spine just snapped, and she fell. The head wounds could have happened when she hit the ground. Theory 2, suicide. Amy had reportedly been depressed. Her marriage was falling apart. Her husband was openly in love with the Queen. There are records of her maid hearing Amy pray to God to deliver her from desperation. And remember, she sent everyone away that day, insisted on being alone. Maybe she wanted privacy for what she was about to do. Maybe those head wounds were from throwing herself down the stairs, trying to make sure the fall would kill her. Theory 3, murder. And if it was murder, the question becomes, who ordered it? Robert Dudley had the most obvious motive. With Amy dead, he'd be free to marry Elizabeth. But here's the thing. Robert wasn't stupid. He knew that if Amy died under suspicious circumstances, he'd be the prime suspect. And he was right. The scandal that followed destroyed any chance he had of marrying the Queen. Would he really have been that foolish? Some historians point to William Cecil, Elizabeth's Secretary of State and Robert's biggest rival. Cecil desperately didn't want Elizabeth to marry Robert. If Amy died naturally, Robert would be free to marry the Queen. But if Amy died suspiciously, the scandal would make that marriage impossible. Did Cecil arrange Amy's death to prevent a marriage he saw as disastrous for England? Or, and this is the darkest possibility, maybe someone killed Amy thinking they were doing Elizabeth a favour. Some overzealous supporter who thought removing Amy would clear the path to the Queen's happiness, not understanding that the scandal would do exactly the opposite. We'll never know for sure. But here's what we do know. The news reached London fast, and the reaction was immediate and devastating. Robert Dudley was with Elizabeth at Windsor Castle when he got word. According to his own letters, he was completely blindsided. He immediately wrote to his steward, Thomas Blount, telling him to go to Cumnor and investigate. "Leave no stone unturned," he wrote. "Make sure the inquest is thorough and honest. Get to the truth." These aren't the words of a guilty man. These are the words of someone who knows he's about to be accused and is desperately trying to protect himself. Elizabeth's reaction was interesting. She immediately separated herself from Robert, physically distanced herself from him at court, wouldn't see him privately, made sure everyone knew she was taking this seriously, because she understood, probably better than anyone, how bad this looked. The gossip started instantly. The Spanish ambassador wrote to King Philip, "The Queen is in love with Lord Robert and never lets him leave her side. They say he has killed his wife to marry her." Another diplomat reported that people were openly saying in the streets that Robert had poisoned Amy and that Elizabeth had been complicit. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for Elizabeth? She'd spent the last 2 years falling in love with this man. Robert Dudley was probably the only person on earth she'd let get close to her since the Thomas Seymour scandal. The only person she trusted. The only person who made her feel like a woman instead of a queen. And now his wife was dead under suspicious circumstances, and everyone thought Elizabeth was involved. The thing is, she almost certainly wasn't. There's no evidence Elizabeth knew anything about Amy's death beforehand, but in the court of public opinion, she was guilty. A queen conspiring to murder her lover's wife so she could marry him. It was scandalous. It was shocking. It was exactly the kind of thing that could trigger a rebellion. Elizabeth's counsel made their position very clear. She could not marry Robert Dudley. Not now, not ever. It didn't matter that she was innocent. It didn't matter that Robert was probably innocent too. The perception was poisonous. If Elizabeth married Robert after this, people would believe she'd orchestrated Amy's murder. Foreign powers would use it as an excuse to invade. English nobles would see her as a woman so blinded by lust that she'd kill for it. She'd lose all credibility, all respect, possibly her throne. So Elizabeth had a choice. She could marry the man she loved and probably lose her kingdom, or she could sacrifice her personal happiness to maintain her power. And we know which choice she made, but I don't think we really understand what that cost her. Think about it from her perspective for a moment. You're 27 years old. You've spent your whole life being careful, being controlled, keeping everyone at arm's length. And then you meet someone you've known since childhood, someone who was with you in the tower, someone who understands what it's like to survive impossible situations. And slowly, carefully, you let your guard down, just a little, just enough to feel something real for the first time since you were 14 years old. And then his wife dies, and suddenly everyone's looking at you like you're a murderer, like you're your father, Henry VIII, who killed wives when they became inconvenient, like you're some passionate, reckless woman who'd throw away her kingdom for a man. And you know that if you choose love, everyone will use it as proof that women can't rule, that female monarchs are too emotional, too easily manipulated, too weak. So you do what you've always done, you lock it away, you put on the mask, you sacrifice the woman for the queen, you stand up in front of your council and foreign ambassadors and your people, and you say, "I am married to England, I need no other husband," and everyone applauds your strength and wisdom. They write poems about your virtue. They call you Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. They celebrate your sacrifice as noble and pure. But nobody asks what it feels like to give up the only person you've ever loved. Nobody notices that something in your eyes goes cold after 1560. Nobody sees that you've just closed the last door that could have led to an actual human life instead of an endless performance. Robert Dudley stayed at court. Elizabeth kept him close. Too close, according to her advisers. She made him Earl of Leicester in 1564. She showered him with lands and titles and money. She saw him nearly every day for the next 30 years, and they never spoke about what might have been, about Amy's death, about the life they could have had together if September 8th, 1560 had gone differently. But there's a detail that breaks my heart. After Robert died in 1588, we'll get to that story later, they found something in Elizabeth's private papers, a letter from Robert written years earlier. Across the top, in Elizabeth's own handwriting, she'd written, "His last letter," and she'd kept it with her most precious possessions until the day she died. She couldn't marry him. She couldn't even publicly mourn him without people gossiping. But she kept his letter, carried it with her. This tiny piece of evidence that, under all that armour, under all that performance, there was still a woman who'd loved someone and lost him. The Amy Robsart scandal taught Elizabeth something devastating. Even if you do everything right, even if you're innocent, even if you follow all the rules, you can still lose everything, because perception matters more than truth. Because as a woman in power, you're always one scandal away from losing it all. Because love is a weakness that people will exploit. So she built her walls even higher, made her mask even more perfect, came even more untouchable, and she told herself it was worth it. That power was enough, that England was enough, that being Gloriana was enough. But what if there was a consequence she didn't see coming? What if, during these years when she and Robert were closest, something happened? Something that had to be kept secret. Something that, if it ever came to light, would destroy everything she'd built? Because in 1587, 27 years after Amy's death, a young man was arrested on the coast of Spain. He claimed he had proof of his identity, documents, a detailed story of his birth and upbringing, and he said his parents were Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. His name was Arthur Dudley, and his story, whether it's true or an elaborate con, opens up the most dangerous secret of all. Because if Elizabeth had a child she had to hide, it would explain so much. The paranoia, the obsessive control over her image, the absolute refusal to ever let anyone examine her body, the desperate need to remain the Virgin Queen at all costs. So let's talk about Arthur Dudley, about the 1561 illness that made Elizabeth's body swell, about the documents that claim to tell the truth, about whether the greatest secret in British royal history isn't just that Elizabeth never married, but that she might have had a child she could never acknowledge. Stay with me. This is where the mystery gets dangerous. Spain, 1587. A coast town. A young man steps off a ship. He's English, or at least he sounds English. He's in his mid-20s, well-spoken, educated, and within hours of arriving he's arrested on suspicion of being a spy. Standard procedure in those days, Spain and England were enemies about to go to war. Any Englishman in Spain was automatically suspicious. But when they interrogate this man, he tells them something that stops everyone in their tracks. He says his name is Arthur Dudley, and he claims, swears actually, that he's the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I of England and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Now you might think the Spanish immediately laughed this off as the desperate lie of a cornered spy, but they didn't. Instead, they took him very, very seriously. They transported him to Madrid. They brought in Francis Englefield, a Catholic aristocrat who'd been exiled from England, who knew the English court intimately, who was secretary to King Philip II himself. And Englefield questioned this young man extensively, wrote down everything he said, and at the end of it all, Englefield couldn't definitively say Arthur was lying. 3 letters from this interrogation still exist today. You can read them. They're in the Spanish archives. And the story Arthur Dudley told is remarkably detailed and consistent. Either he's telling the truth, or he's an incredibly skilled con artist. Let me tell you what he said. According to Arthur, he was born in 1561 at a royal residence. He was immediately taken from his mother. He didn't know who she was at the time, and given to a servant named Robert Southern to raise. Southern took him to a village in the countryside and raised him as his own son, but Southern treated him differently than other children, made sure he was educated, taught him languages, literature, mathematics, gave him the kind of education reserved for nobility, not for the son of a servant. When Arthur was old enough to ask questions, "Why are you spending so much money on my education? Why do I live differently than other children?" Southern finally told him the truth, or at least a version of it. He said Arthur's mother was a lady of a great estate who'd fallen pregnant out of wedlock. The baby had to be hidden to protect the mother's reputation, and Robert Southern had been paid handsomely to take the child and raise him far from court, far from London, where no one would ask questions. Arthur pressed for more information. Who was his mother? Who was his father? And eventually Southern told him, "Your mother is the Queen. Your father is the Earl of Leicester. You are their secret." Now, before you dismiss this entirely, let me tell you about 1561, because something very strange happened to Elizabeth that year, something that's documented but never fully explained. In early 1561, Elizabeth became mysteriously ill. The illness lasted for months, and according to multiple sources, foreign ambassadors who were watching her closely caught gossip that was written down, even some official records. Her body began to swell, particularly her abdomen, to the point where people whispered that she looked pregnant. The Spanish ambassador at the time wrote that she was suffering from a swelling of the abdomen which causes suspicion. Another diplomat reported that Elizabeth was so sick she was bedridden for weeks, that she wouldn't allow most of her doctors to examine her, that only her most trusted physician was permitted near her. And then, suddenly, after several months, she was fine. The swelling went down, she appeared in public again. Life went back to normal. Officially, it was never explained. No diagnosis was ever recorded. Elizabeth herself never spoke about it publicly, and historians have been arguing for centuries about what actually happened. Some say it was a tumour, an ovarian cyst maybe, some kind of abdominal growth that eventually resolved on its own. Some suggest it could have been a suitors, fluid accumulation from liver or kidney problems. Some even think it might have been a false pregnancy, hysterical pregnancy, where Elizabeth's body convinced itself it was pregnant because she was under so much pressure to produce an heir. But here's what makes Arthur Dudley's story interesting. The timing lines up perfectly. If Elizabeth had given birth secretly in 1561, Arthur's age in 1587 would be exactly right. He'd be 26 years old, which is exactly how old he appeared to be. And there's another detail that's hard to ignore. In 1559, 2 years before this mysterious illness, Robert Dudley's bedchambers were moved to be right next to Elizabeth's apartments. This is documented. It was noted by multiple people at court. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about it, scandalised. Lord Robert has his chambers adjoining the Queen's, they reported. He visits her day and night. So we have opportunity. Robert and Elizabeth had private access to each other. We have a mysterious illness that caused Elizabeth's body to swell. We have a young man with a convincing story and the right age. And we have 3 Spanish officials who interviewed him at length and couldn't disprove his claims. Does that make it true? Not necessarily. Let's look at the problems with Arthur's story. First, if Elizabeth had a baby in 1561, how did no one notice? She was the Queen. She was watched constantly. Ladies-in-waiting dressed her, undressed her, attended her at all times. Ambassadors reported on her every move. The idea that she could carry a pregnancy to term, give birth, and hide it completely seems impossible. Unless, and this is where it gets interesting, the illness was the cover. Think about it. Elizabeth is sick. She's bedridden. She refuses to see anyone except her most trusted servants. For months. And when she emerges, the swelling is gone. If you were going to hide a royal pregnancy, that's exactly how you'd do it. Create a medical excuse to isolate yourself. Give birth in secret. Hand the baby off immediately and emerge claiming you've recovered from whatever mysterious illness afflicted you. Second problem, Robert Southern. Arthur claims this man raised him, told him the secret, had documents proving his identity. But Robert Southern died shortly before Arthur made his claims. Conveniently, the one person who could verify or disprove Arthur's story was no longer alive to be questioned. That's suspicious. It could mean Arthur was lying, making up a story and pinning it on a dead man who couldn't contradict him. Or it could mean that Southern's death freed Arthur to finally tell the truth he'd been carrying his whole life. Third problem. Why would Arthur come forward at all? If he really was Elizabeth and Robert's secret son, coming forward would be incredibly dangerous. Elizabeth couldn't acknowledge him without destroying her carefully constructed image as the Virgin Queen. The scandal would be enormous. Arthur had to know that. So why risk it? The answer might be in what was happening in 1587. Elizabeth was 54 years old. She'd never named an heir. England was about to go to war with Spain. The succession was in chaos. Maybe Arthur thought this was his moment. Maybe he believed that if he could prove his identity, he had a claim to the throne. Maybe someone else, someone in Spain perhaps, convinced him to come forward, thinking they could use him as a political weapon against Elizabeth. Or maybe he was just a con artist who saw an opportunity and took it. Francis Englefield, the man who interrogated Arthur, sent his findings to King Philip II, and Philip did nothing. He didn't publicize Arthur's claims, didn't use him as propaganda against Elizabeth, didn't parade him around as proof that the Virgin Queen was a fraud. Why not? If Philip really believed Arthur was Elizabeth's son, it would have been the perfect weapon. The scandal would have weakened Elizabeth politically, maybe even destabilized her government. The fact that Philip stayed silent suggests one of two things. Either he didn't believe Arthur's story, or he did believe it but thought keeping it secret gave him more leverage than exposing it. Arthur Dudley disappears from the historical record after 1587. We don't know what happened to him. Whether he was imprisoned, sent away, killed, or just faded into obscurity, the mystery remains unsolved. But here's what haunts me about this story. Whether Arthur was telling the truth or not, the fact that his story was plausible says something devastating about Elizabeth's life. The fact that foreign powers could look at the relationship between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley and think, yes, it's entirely possible she had a secret child. That tells you everything about how trapped she was. Because think about what would have happened if Arthur's story was true. If Elizabeth had gotten pregnant in 1561, what were her options? She couldn't marry Robert. Amy was still alive at that point, and even after Amy's death, the scandal made marriage impossible. She couldn't acknowledge the child. That would destroy her image as the Virgin Queen, would prove her critics right that women were too emotional and passionate to rule effectively, would give her enemies ammunition to depose her. So if she did have a child, she would have had to hide it, give it away, send it to be raised by someone else somewhere far from court, never acknowledge it, never claim it, spend the rest of her life knowing her child was out there somewhere, possibly wondering who his mother was, while she stood in front of crowds and proclaimed herself married to England, virginally devoted to her kingdom. Can you imagine carrying that secret? Having a child you can never hold, never claim, never love openly. Watching the years pass, wondering if he's okay, if he's being treated well, if he'll ever understand why you had to give him up. And knowing that if the secret ever came out, everything you've built would collapse. That's the thing about being the Virgin Queen. It wasn't just about not getting married. It was about erasing your entire humanity. No husband, no children, no family of your own, no personal life that wasn't carefully choreographed for public consumption. Elizabeth had to be perpetually untouched, perpetually pure, perpetually above the messy reality of human relationships and human bodies. And if Arthur Dudley was telling the truth, then Elizabeth spent 26 years knowing she'd given up her child to protect her crown. That's not strength, that's tragedy. But here's what really gets me. Even if Arthur was lying, even if Elizabeth never had a child, the fact that people believed it was possible, the fact that it remains a mystery to this day, shows how much of Elizabeth's life was hidden, how much she had to conceal, how much of herself she had to lock away to maintain the image of Gloriana. And here's the cruel irony. All that hiding, all that secrecy, all that careful control of her image, it was killing her, literally. Because while Elizabeth was busy protecting her reputation, while she was building her mask and maintaining her mythology, she was also painting her face with poison every single day. The white makeup she wore to cover her smallpox scars, it was called ceruse, Venetian ceruse, and it was made of white lead and vinegar, 30% lead carbonate. She applied it every morning, thick enough to hide every imperfection, and every morning that lead soaked into her skin, entered her bloodstream, started destroying her from the inside out. The Virgin Queen was killing herself to look the part, and by the time she realized what was happening, it was far too late to stop. Let me tell you about the poison she wore like armor, and how vanity became the weapon that finally brought down the woman who'd survived everything else. This is where the physical destruction begins. Every morning for 40 years, Elizabeth sat at her dressing table and applied poison to her face. She didn't know it was poison, of course. Nobody did. In 1559, when she first started using it, Venetian ceruse was considered the height of beauty, the makeup of queens and noble women, the secret to flawless, luminous white skin. It was expensive, imported, prestigious, and it was killing everyone who wore it. Let me tell you what ceruse actually was. It was white lead carbonate mixed with vinegar to create a paste. You'd apply it thick, smoothing it over your entire face and neck, creating a perfect white mask. Then you'd add rouge made from red lead for your lips and cheeks. Then coal made from antimony, another toxic metal, around your eyes. Layer after layer of poison every single day. And here's the thing about lead poisoning. It's insidious. It doesn't kill you overnight. It accumulates in your body slowly, steadily, over years. It settles in your bones, your organs, your brain, and by the time you realize something's wrong, the damage is already catastrophic. But why did Elizabeth need this makeup so badly? Why was she willing to cake her face in this stuff every morning for 4 decades? To answer that, we need to go back to October 1562. Elizabeth is 29 years old. She's been queen for 4 years, and she catches smallpox. Now you have to understand, smallpox in Tudor England was a death sentence more often than not. The mortality rate was around 30%, and even if you survived, you were left with deep pitted scars all over your face and body. For anyone, that's traumatic. For a queen whose power partly rested on her image as a beautiful, semi-divine figure, it was devastating. Elizabeth nearly died. She was so sick that her council gathered to discuss the succession because they thought she wouldn't make it. For 10 days she lay in bed with a raging fever covered in pustules. Her ladies-in-waiting were terrified. The whole country held its breath. She survived, but her face was ruined. The smooth, pale skin that had been admired in portraits, praised by poets, celebrated across Europe, covered in scars. Deep pockmarks that no amount of conventional makeup could hide. And here's where the tragedy begins. Because Elizabeth couldn't just accept the scars. She was a woman ruling in a man's world. Her appearance was political. Her beauty was part of her power. She'd built this image of herself as Gloriana, the eternally youthful, divinely beautiful queen. Scars didn't fit that image. Scars made her look old, damaged, vulnerable. And she couldn't afford vulnerability, so she started using ceruse. It was the only thing thick enough to cover the scarring. You'd apply it in layers until your face became a smooth white mask, a blank canvas, and from a distance, it looked flawless, like porcelain, like the face of a goddess, not a woman. But up close, people could tell something was off. The makeup cracked when she smiled or spoke. It had a chalky, unnatural texture, and if you were really close enough to see her in private, you could see what the lead was doing to her skin underneath. Let me walk you through what lead poisoning does to the human body, because it's important to understand this. When you apply lead to your skin repeatedly, it gets absorbed. Slowly, yes, but steadily. And once it's in your bloodstream, it starts causing damage everywhere. First, it attacks your skin. Ironically, the very thing Elizabeth was using to improve her appearance was destroying it. Lead causes your skin to become grey and lifeless. It creates lesions and sores. It makes your complexion dull and sickly, which means you need more makeup to cover the damage, which causes more damage. It's a vicious cycle. The cure becomes worse than the disease. Second, it attacks your nervous system. Lead poisoning causes tremors, your hands shake uncontrollably. It causes cognitive problems, memory loss, confusion, difficulty concentrating. It causes mood swings, sudden anger, depression, paranoia. Does any of this sound familiar? Because we have extensive records of Elizabeth in her later years showing all these symptoms. Third, it attacks your internal organs, your liver, your kidneys, your digestive system. Lead poisoning causes chronic abdominal pain, nausea, constipation. It causes weakness and fatigue. It makes you more susceptible to infections because it suppresses your immune system. And here's the really cruel part, it's irreversible. Once lead is in your bones and organs, you can't get it out. Not with Tudor medicine. Not with modern medicine, really, except in acute cases caught early. The damage is permanent. By the 1590s, Elizabeth is in her 60s now, the symptoms are impossible to ignore. Multiple courtiers wrote about her appearance in private letters. One described her face as having a strange pallor not natural, with dark shadows beneath the eyes. Another mentioned that Her Majesty's skin has taken on a greyish cast beneath the white paint. And the smell. Multiple sources mention a strange metallic smell around Elizabeth. That's actually a symptom of lead poisoning. It can cause a metallic taste in your mouth and a peculiar odour to your breath. The Spanish ambassador wrote that being near the Queen required strong perfumes to make the experience bearable. But Elizabeth couldn't stop. By this point, her real skin underneath the makeup was so damaged, so scarred, so discoloured from decades of lead absorption, that she looked worse without the ceruse than with it. The makeup had become a necessity, not a choice. She was trapped in a cycle of her own making. Think about what that must have been like. Every morning you sit down and apply the stuff that's slowly killing you. You know it makes you feel sick. You know your hands shake more after you've applied it. You know that strange metallic taste in your mouth is getting worse. But you also know that without it you look like a monster. Without it people see the real damage. Without it, you're just an old scarred woman instead of Gloriana, the eternal virgin queen. So you keep painting, keep poisoning, keep dying slowly because the alternative, showing the truth, is worse than death. And here's what really gets me. Elizabeth wasn't stupid, she wasn't ignorant. By the 1590s, there were doctors who suspected the makeup was dangerous. There were alternative cosmetics available that didn't contain lead, but switching would mean admitting that the makeup she'd been using for 30 years was harmful. It would mean admitting vulnerability. It would mean acknowledging that the Virgin Queen, untouchable, perfect, eternal, was actually a human woman whose body was breaking down. She couldn't do it. The mask had become her face. The poison had become her armour. And stopping would mean everything she'd built crumbling down. There's a portrait of Elizabeth from 1599 called the Ditchley Portrait. She's standing on a map of England dressed in an elaborate white gown covered in jewels. Her face is painted stark white with ceruse, her lips bright red, her eyes lined with black. She looks magnificent, powerful, eternal. But if you look closely at her hands in the painting, she's wearing gloves, but you can see a bit of her wrists. The skin looks strange, discoloured, because even in official propaganda portraits, they couldn't completely hide what the lead was doing to her. And yet Elizabeth kept performing, kept painting her face white, kept telling everyone she was fine, everything was under control, she was still Gloriana, even as her body was literally rotting from the inside out. You know what the worst part is? She probably could have stopped after the first few years. After her face healed from the smallpox, if she just accepted the scars, if she'd been allowed to age naturally, she might have lived a longer, healthier life. But she couldn't, because admitting imperfection would have been seen as weakness, and weakness for a female monarch was political suicide. So instead she chose physical suicide. Slow, painful, denial-filled suicide. Death by vanity. Death by the impossible standards she set for herself. death by the need to be perfect even when perfection was killing her. But the lead poisoning, devastating as it was, wasn't the only way her body was being destroyed. Because while she was painting poison on her face every morning, she was also lacing herself into another instrument of torture every single day. Something that squeezed her torso so tightly that it literally reshaped her bones. Something that left grooves carved into her ribs. Something that made breathing difficult and standing exhausting, and eventually contributed to internal damage so severe that when they finally undressed her corpse, the servants who saw it were horrified. I'm talking about her corset, and not just any corset, the tight, rigid, unforgiving steel-boned corsets of the Elizabethan era. Let me tell you what 45 years of wearing that thing did to her body. Because this is where the physical torture really becomes clear. There's something you need to understand about Elizabethan fashion. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to transform the human body into a symbol. And for Elizabeth, that symbol needed to be perfect, powerful, intimidating, not remotely human. Her gowns weighed up to 50 pounds. That's not an exaggeration. Historians have studied surviving Elizabethan court dresses and weighed them. 50 pounds of fabric, jewels, embroidery, padding and structure. Imagine walking around all day carrying a small person on your shoulders. That's what Elizabeth did every single day for decades. But the gowns were just the outer layer. Underneath was the real torture device, the corset. And Tudor corsets weren't like the romanticised versions you see in movies. They were rigid cages made of wood, whalebone or steel. They laced up the back so tight that your waist could be compressed by several inches. The goal was to create a completely flat triangular silhouette. No curves, no natural shape, just rigid, geometric perfection. Elizabeth wore these every single day from the moment she became queen at 25 until her death at 69. 44 years. And here's what we know from the accounts of what happened when they finally removed her body from its clothes after death. The corset had left permanent grooves in her torso, deep indentations in her ribs where the boning had pressed against bone for decades. Some of her ribs had actually bent inward from the constant pressure. A few were cracked. This isn't speculation. This is documented in the accounts of the ladies who prepared her body for burial. They were so shocked by what they saw that some of them wrote about it in private letters years later, when Elizabeth was safely dead and couldn't punish them for talking. One lady in waiting, her name was lost to history, but her letter survived, wrote, "The marks upon Her Majesty's body were such as I had never seen. The corset had carved its shape into her very bones. I wept to see it." Think about what this means practically. Elizabeth couldn't take deep breaths. The corset compressed her lungs. She couldn't eat large meals. There was no room for her stomach to expand. She couldn't bend or twist naturally. Every movement had to be slow, controlled, graceful, because the corset made it impossible to move quickly or naturally. And she couldn't take it off. Not really. Oh, she'd remove it at night, but her body had been shaped by it for so long that she probably felt wrong without it, like something was missing. Your body adapts to constant pressure, and eventually you can't remember what normal feels like. But here's where it gets medically serious. Constant compression of your torso doesn't just affect your ribs and breathing, it affects everything inside. Your organs get squeezed, pushed out of their natural positions. Your digestive system can't function properly. Your circulation is compromised. And if you have any kind of internal issue, a tumour, an infection, an abscess, the corset makes it worse by putting constant pressure on the problem area. And Elizabeth had problems. Multiple sources from her later years mention that she had chronic pain in her abdomen, that she often couldn't stand for long periods without needing to sit and rest, that she experienced digestive issues, and most tellingly, that there was a smell. Let's talk about the smell. because this comes up over and over in accounts from people who were close to Elizabeth in her final years. And it's always described carefully, euphemistically, because you don't just come out and say the Queen smells bad. But the message is clear. The French ambassador wrote in 1597, "Her Majesty's chambers require constant airing and much perfume." A lady-in-waiting's letter from after Elizabeth's death is more explicit. There was a corruption in Her Majesty's body that no perfume could disguise, a smell of sickness and decay that pervaded her rooms. We burned incense constantly, but it only masked the worst of it. What causes a smell like that? Something rotting, something infected, an abscess maybe, or a tumour that's become necrotic. An internal infection that Elizabeth's compromised immune system, remember the lead poisoning, can't fight off. Something in her abdomen that's getting worse over time but that she refuses to let anyone examine properly. Because here's the thing, Elizabeth wouldn't let doctors examine her. Not really. There are records of her putting off medical attention for weeks, even when she was clearly in pain. And when she did finally allow a physician to see her, she'd only permit the most minimal, superficial examination. No touching, no undressing, no proper diagnostic work. Why? Well, there are a few theories. The most obvious is modesty. She was the Virgin Queen after all. Allowing a male doctor to examine her body intimately would compromise that image. But I think it's deeper than that. I think Elizabeth knew that if doctors examined her properly, they'd see the damage, the lead poisoning, the corset deformities, whatever was causing that smell. They'd see that the perfect eternal Gloriana was actually a woman whose body was falling apart. And she couldn't let that happen. So she suffered in silence, refused proper medical care, lived with chronic pain and progressive illness because admitting she needed help would shatter the illusion, and the symptoms kept getting worse. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth is in her late 60s now, she's experiencing swelling in her abdomen, severe swelling. Multiple sources describe her looking 6 months pregnant. For the Virgin Queen, this must have been psychologically devastating. After a lifetime of virginity, refusing marriage and children, her body was mocking her with the appearance of pregnancy. Medically, abdominal swelling like that usually indicates fluid accumulation, ascites it's called. It happens when your liver or kidneys aren't functioning properly and can't process fluids, so the fluid backs up into your abdominal cavity. It can also indicate a large tumour. Either way, it's a sign of serious organ failure. But Elizabeth couldn't acknowledge it, couldn't seek proper treatment, so the swelling got worse. Her gowns had to be adjusted to accommodate it. She had to sit more often because standing was exhausting when you're carrying that much extra fluid. And all the while, she kept wearing the corset, kept maintaining the rigid posture, kept performing. Do you ever think about what it must have been like to be her doctors? To see the Queen obviously ill, obviously in pain, obviously deteriorating, and not be able to help because she won't let you. There are records of her physicians pleading with her to allow proper examination, to rest, to let them treat her, and she'd refuse. Or she'd agree but then cancel at the last minute. Or she'd allow such a minimal examination that they couldn't actually diagnose anything. One of her doctors wrote in frustration, "Her Majesty insists she is well, though it is clear to all who attend her that she is not. She will not be counselled. She will not rest. She continues as if nothing is amiss, and we are helpless to intervene." Imagine being trapped in a body that's slowly failing, knowing something is terribly wrong, but refusing to acknowledge it because acknowledgement would mean admitting weakness. That's where Elizabeth lived for the last decade of her life. And there's one more detail that makes this even more heartbreaking. When they finally undressed Elizabeth's body after death, and remember, they sealed her in lead within hours, so we only have brief accounts from the people who were there There was confusion about what they found between her legs. The descriptions are vague and contradictory. One account says absent, another says malformed, another just says wrong. Nobody could agree on exactly what they saw, which suggests either extreme scarring, some kind of deformity, or possibly the effects of whatever internal issue had been causing the smell and the swelling. We'll never know for sure because they sealed that body so fast and so permanently that no one will ever examine it. But the fact that even the women who prepared her for burial, women who'd seen plenty of naked female bodies, were shocked and confused tells you something was very abnormal. Was it a birth defect? Was it damage from the Thomas Seymour abuse when she was 14? Was it the result of decades of wearing rigid corsets that compressed everything? Was it related to whatever was causing the internal infection? We don't know. We'll never know, because Elizabeth took that secret to her grave, and her government made sure it stayed there. But here's what kills me about all of this. Elizabeth's body, the same body that everyone obsessed over, that ambassadors reported on, that marriage negotiations centered around, that her counsel insisted needed to be married off and used for producing heirs, that body was literally destroying itself to maintain the image everyone demanded of her. The makeup that kept her looking eternally youthful was poisoning her. The corsets that gave her that perfect royal silhouette were crushing her organs. The constant pressure to look perfect, be perfect, perform perfection was killing her in the most literal, physical way possible. And she couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, couldn't take care of herself, because the myth of Gloriana was more important than the reality of Elizabeth Tudor. The Virgin Queen had to be eternal, untouchable, perfect. And if maintaining that meant destroying the human woman underneath, well, that was the price of power. But there was one person who saw through the mask. One person who loved the woman underneath the costume, not the queen on the throne. One person who stayed by her side for 30 years, who understood what the performance was costing her, who wanted to give her an actual life but couldn't, because the scandal of Amy Robsart's death had poisoned any chance they had at happiness. Robert Dudley, her Robin, the man she loved but could never have. And in 1579, 17 years after Amy's death, Robert did something that broke Elizabeth's heart all over again. He got married, in secret, to Elizabeth's own cousin, and when Elizabeth found out, something inside her shattered. Let me tell you about the second betrayal and why it proved that even the people who loved her most couldn't reach her anymore. September 1578, Wanstead House just outside London. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the man Elizabeth had loved for 20 years, the man she'd showered with titles and land and money, the man she saw nearly every day, gets married in a secret ceremony. The bride is Lettice Knollys. She's beautiful, vivacious, significantly younger than Robert, and she's Elizabeth's first cousin once removed, Elizabeth's own blood relative. Robert doesn't tell Elizabeth about the marriage. He keeps it secret. Continues coming to court every day like nothing has changed. Continues playing his role as the Queen's favourite. Continues accepting her affection, her gifts, her obvious devotion. All while hiding the fact that he's now somebody else's husband. For almost a year, Elizabeth doesn't know. Can you imagine? The man you love, the one person you've let close to you despite everything, is lying to you every single day, meeting your eyes, accepting your trust, and hiding the most important thing in his life from you. The truth comes out in July 1579. Someone at court, probably someone who didn't like Robert, and he had plenty of enemies, makes sure Elizabeth finds out, and her reaction tells you everything about how deeply this wounded her. She didn't have Robert executed. She could have. Marriage without the sovereign's consent was technically treason, especially for someone as high-ranking as Leicester. She didn't throw him in the tower. She didn't exile him. Instead, she banished him from court for a few months, made him stay away from her, and that was it. But here's what the history books don't always capture. This wasn't political punishment. This was a woman whose heart had just been broken. Again. By the same man. In a different way. When Robert was finally allowed back at court, Elizabeth's behaviour toward him had changed. Oh, she still kept him close. Still gave him positions and honours. Still saw him regularly. But something was different. Colder. More guarded. One courtier described it as Her Majesty treats Lord Leicester with great courtesy, but there is a distance now that was not there before. Because think about what this meant to Elizabeth. For 17 years after Amy's death, Elizabeth and Robert had existed in this strange limbo. They couldn't marry. The scandal made it impossible. But they also couldn't let go of each other. They'd maintained this intense, intimate, but ultimately unconsummated relationship. She'd convinced herself that, even though they couldn't be together officially, he was still hers in every way that mattered. And then he goes and marries someone else. Someone younger. Someone who can give him children. Someone who doesn't have to worry about maintaining a perfect public image. Someone who gets to actually have him, while Elizabeth just gets to perform devotion. The worst part, Elizabeth couldn't even be openly angry about it. She couldn't rage or cry or demand explanations, because doing so would mean admitting that she cared, that Robert wasn't just her courtier but something more, that the Virgin Queen married to England actually had personal feelings that could be hurt, that would shatter the carefully constructed image she'd built over 20 years. So she did what she always did. She swallowed it, put on the mask, performed graciousness and magnanimity, pretended it didn't matter, and died a little more inside. But here's where it gets even more painful. Elizabeth and Robert continued their relationship after his marriage. Not a romantic relationship. I don't think they ever really had that, honestly. But an emotional one. Deep, complicated, impossible to define. He remained her closest advisor. She still trusted him with important state business. They still had private conversations, still exchanged gifts and letters. Do you see how twisted this is? Robert had chosen to marry someone else, but he also refused to give up his position with Elizabeth. He wanted both. The wife who could give him a normal life, and the queen who gave him power and status and meaning. And Elizabeth let him have both because losing him completely would have been worse than sharing him. It's codependency at the highest level. Two people who've known each other since childhood, who've survived impossible situations together, who understand each other better than anyone else ever could, but who also can't give each other what they actually need. Robert needs a family, a normal life. Elizabeth needs someone who sees her as a person, not a symbol. But their circumstances make both things impossible. And this went on for 9 more years. 9 years of this complicated, painful, impossible relationship. Robert playing husband at home and favourite at court. Elizabeth performing the role of magnanimous queen while watching the man she loved live the life she couldn't give him. Then 1588 happens. England is at war with Spain. The Spanish Armada is sailing toward England's shores. It's the greatest threat Elizabeth's reign has ever faced. If the Spanish succeed in landing troops, it could mean the end of Protestant England, the end of Elizabeth's rule, possibly the end of Elizabeth herself. Robert Dudley is put in command of the English land forces. It's an enormous responsibility. At 55 years old, he's organising troops, coordinating defences, preparing for possible invasion. And on August 8th, 1588, Elizabeth comes to Tilbury to address the troops. This is where she gives her famous speech. "I know I have the body of a weakened, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England too." Robert organised that whole event. He invited Elizabeth. He coordinated her security. He made sure she could have her moment to inspire the troops. It's the last great thing they do together. The last time they stand side by side as queen and commander, facing down an existential threat to everything they've built. England wins, the Armada is defeated. More by weather than military action, honestly, but they win. Elizabeth's reign is secure. It's a triumph, a moment of glory. And less than a month later, Robert Dudley is dead. He dies on September 4th, 1588, at his lodge in Cornbury. The cause is unclear. Probably some kind of sudden illness, maybe a heart attack or stroke. He's been complaining of stomach pains and fever for a few days, but nothing that seemed serious. And then he's just gone. The news reaches Elizabeth while she's at court. According to witnesses, she went completely silent, didn't cry, didn't speak, just stood there frozen. And then she walked to her private chambers and locked the door behind her. She stayed in that room for days, wouldn't come out, wouldn't eat, wouldn't see anyone. Her counsellors got worried. They knocked on the door, pleaded with her to emerge. No response. Finally, Lord Berkeley, William Cecil, her most trusted adviser, had to order the door broken down. They found Elizabeth sitting in the dark, still in the same dress she'd been wearing when she got the news, just sitting there staring at nothing. This is one of the only times in Elizabeth's entire reign where she completely lost control, where the mask shattered and the grief underneath came pouring out, and even then she only allowed herself a few days. By the end of the week she was back in public, composed, controlled, the Virgin Queen grieving with appropriate dignity. But in her private chambers they found something that broke the hearts of everyone who saw it. Robert's last letter to her. He'd written it just before he died, talking about his illness, making plans for the future, signing it, "Your most humble and devoted servant." And across the top in Elizabeth's handwriting were 2 words, "His last letter." She kept that letter in a special box by her bed for the rest of her life. 15 years. When she died in 1603, they found it among her most precious possessions, still labelled "His last letter" in her shaky handwriting. Do you understand what I'm telling you? For 30 years, Elizabeth loved Robert Dudley. For 30 years, she couldn't have him. First because of Amy, then because he chose to marry someone else, then because he died. For 30 years she maintained this impossible relationship that gave her just enough emotional connection to survive, but never enough to actually be happy. And when he died, she couldn't even publicly mourn him the way she wanted to. She had to mourn like a queen losing a valued servant, not like a woman losing the love of her life. She had to be measured, appropriate, dignified. She couldn't scream or rage or fall apart. She got 4 days alone in a dark room, and then she had to go back to performing. That's what it cost to be Elizabeth. That's what the Virgin Queen persona demanded. Not just that she give up marriage and children, but that she couldn't even fully grieve the person she loved most. Everything had to be filtered through the role. Everything had to be appropriate. Everything had to maintain the image. And here's what really gets me. Robert's widow Lettice outlived Elizabeth by 30 years. She got to grieve openly. She got to remarry later if she wanted. She got to have a life after Robert's death. But Elizabeth just kept performing for another 15 years, kept ruling, kept wearing the mask, until her body literally couldn't do it anymore. You know what the cruelest part of this whole story is? If Amy Robsart hadn't died that day in 1560, everything could have been different. If Robert had divorced Amy, scandalous but possible. Or if Amy had died of natural causes a few years later without any suspicion, Elizabeth and Robert might have actually gotten married. She might have had a real partnership, real companionship, a real life instead of an endless performance. But Amy died under suspicious circumstances, and that one event poisoned everything that came after, for 30 years, until Robert died and took Elizabeth's last chance at happiness with him. And after his death, something in Elizabeth changed permanently. She was 55 years old. She'd lost the last person who really knew her, who'd been there since the beginning, who understood where she came from and what she'd survived. Everyone else in her life was younger, didn't remember the early years, saw her only as the eternal virgin queen. She was alone. Truly, completely alone for the first time in her life. And she had 14 more years to live like that. 14 more years of ruling, performing, maintaining the mask, all while knowing that the one person who saw through it was gone. But Elizabeth still had counsellors pushing her, still had ambassadors arriving with marriage proposals, because even at 55, even after everything, people still thought she should marry, still insisted she needed a husband. And there was one last suitor, one final attempt at finding Elizabeth a match, a French prince, young enough to be her son, and against all logic, against everything we know about Elizabeth's resistance to marriage, she almost said yes. Let me tell you about the last time Elizabeth Tudor allowed herself to dream of a normal life, and how that dream turned into one more secret she'd have to carry. The French ambassador arrives at court in the summer of 1579 with a proposal that makes everyone stop and stare. His master, King Henry III of France, has a younger brother, Francis, Duke of Alençon, 24 years old, Catholic, but willing to be flexible on religious matters. Not particularly handsome. In fact, he's severely scarred from smallpox, short with a prominent nose. But he's a prince, a real, legitimate option for marriage. And he's interested in Elizabeth. Elizabeth is 46 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. She's 46. He's 24, 22 years younger, young enough to be her son. And yet somehow, this becomes the most serious courtship of Elizabeth's entire reign. Now here's what you need to understand. By 1579, everyone had given up on Elizabeth ever marrying. She'd been turning down suitors for 20 years. She'd perfected the art of saying maybe later, and then finding excuses to delay negotiations until the other side gave up. Her council had stopped pushing. Parliament had stopped pestering. Everyone had accepted that the Virgin Queen would remain a virgin. And then Francis, who went by his other title, Duke of Anjou, decides he actually wants to meet Elizabeth. Not just negotiate through ambassadors, actually come to England and court her in person. This wasn't normal. Royal marriages were business transactions, arranged through letters and treaties. You didn't actually court the person. You negotiated terms with their representatives, signed contracts, showed up for the wedding. Romance wasn't part of the equation, but Francis insisted, and in August 1579 he arrives in England secretly, travels to Elizabeth's residence at Greenwich, and something completely unexpected happens. They like each other. Multiple witnesses, courtiers, ambassadors, Elizabeth's own ladies, report that Elizabeth and Francis genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They talked for hours, laughed together. Elizabeth seemed lighter, younger, almost giddy. One courtier wrote, "Her Majesty appears more girlish in his presence than I have seen her in 20 years. And here's the thing that breaks my heart. I think Elizabeth actually considered it. Really seriously considered marrying him. Think about what her life looked like at 46. Robert Dudley had betrayed her by marrying Lettice the year before. She was getting older. The performance was getting harder. She was tired, bone-deep tired of being alone. And here was this young man, a prince, actually courting her, making her feel desired, making her feel like a woman instead of a monument. But the moment she started seriously entertaining the idea, everything exploded. Her council was divided. Some thought it was a good idea. England needed an alliance with France, and this marriage could provide it. Others were horrified. He was Catholic, he was French, he He was too young, it would be a disaster. The debates got heated, vicious even. Elizabeth's most trusted advisers were yelling at each other in council meetings about whether their 46-year-old queen should marry a 24-year-old French prince. And then there was the public reaction. The English people hated the idea, hated it. A pamphlet appeared, written anonymously but probably by a lawyer named John Stubbs, called The Discovery of a Gaping Gulf. It argued passionately that Elizabeth marrying Alençon would be dangerous for England, that he was too young, that he'd control her, that she was too old to safely have children, that the marriage would be a disaster. Elizabeth was furious. She had Stubbs arrested, and here's where you see how much this issue was hurting her. She had him punished in the most brutal way. They cut off his right hand as punishment for writing against her marriage. This is the same Elizabeth who prided herself on being merciful, who'd spent her reign avoiding the kind of brutal punishments her sister Mary had inflicted. But this pamphlet hit too close to home, because Stubbs wasn't just making political arguments, he was making it personal, talking about Elizabeth's age, her body, her ability to have children, all the things she was desperately trying not to think about. According to witnesses, after the hand was cut off, Stubbs raised his left hand and shouted, "God save the Queen," before he fainted. The crowd watching was silent, horrified. This wasn't justice, this was cruelty. And everyone knew it was because Elizabeth was wounded, defensive, lashing out. Francis came back to England in November 1581, stayed for 3 months this time, and the courtship intensified. Elizabeth gave him a ring, called him a frog as a pet name, apparently referring to his appearance, but affectionately. They talked about marriage seriously, made plans, and then, one day in November, Elizabeth called her council together and told them she'd decided to marry Francis. The room exploded. Her councillors started arguing immediately, some in favour, more against. The noise level got so high that Elizabeth stood up and walked out of the meeting, left them all there, still arguing, while she went to her private chambers. What happened next is documented by multiple sources. Elizabeth spent the night crying, sobbing so hard her ladies could hear her through the door. In the morning she called Francis to her and told him she couldn't marry him. Why? What changed her mind? I think it was the realization that she couldn't win. If she married him, half her council would be furious. Her people would be upset and she'd have to share her power with a man 22 years younger than her. Everyone would assume he was controlling her. She'd lose respect, lose authority, lose everything she'd built. But if she didn't marry him, she'd lose her last chance at having a companion, at not being alone, at having something resembling a normal life. There was no good choice. Either option meant losing something essential, so she chose what she always chose: power over happiness, England over Elizabeth, the crown over the woman. Francis left England in February 1582. Elizabeth gave him £10,000 as a farewell gift, an enormous sum, accompanied him to the coast personally, which was unprecedented, and according to witnesses, when he sailed away, Elizabeth stood on the shore watching his ship disappear, and she cried. She never seriously entertained marriage again after that. At 48, she'd officially closed that door forever. And you know what Parliament did? Within months, they were back to pestering her about marriage, about the succession, about needing an heir. Like the last 3 years hadn't happened. Like she hadn't just gone through the most painful personal decision of her life. They just moved on, started suggesting other candidates. Elizabeth's response was brilliant and heartbreaking. In a speech to Parliament in 1586, she said, "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the kingdom of England, and behold the pledge of this my wedlock and marriage with my kingdom." She held up her coronation ring, the ring she had worn since 1559, the ring that symbolized her marriage to England. "And do not upbraid me with miserable lack of children," she continued, "for every one of you, and as many as are English, are children and kinsmen to me." On paper it sounds triumphant, inspiring, the Virgin Queen devoted to her people. But can you hear the pain underneath? "Do not upbraid me with miserable lack of children." She's 53 years old. She knows it's too late. She knows she'll never have a family, and her parliament is basically rubbing it in, demanding she find a solution to a problem she can't solve anymore. That speech was one of the last times Elizabeth spoke publicly about marriage. After that, she just stopped engaging with the topic. When ambassadors brought proposals, she'd politely deflect. When her counsel tried to discuss it, she'd change the subject. The door was closed. The conversation was over. And here's the thing that really gets me. I think Elizabeth made the right choice. Not the happy choice, but the right one for England. Francis was unreliable politically. The marriage probably would have been a disaster. She likely would have lost her authority. England might have suffered. But knowing you made the right choice doesn't make it hurt less, does it? Elizabeth spent the last 20 years of her life knowing she'd chosen correctly and being utterly miserable about it. She threw herself into work, governed intensely, dealt with threats from Spain, rebellion in Ireland, plots against her life. She was brilliant at it, effective, strong, everything a monarch should be. But at night in her private chambers she was alone, completely, devastatingly alone. No husband, no children, no family, just ladies in waiting who were paid to attend her, counsellors who wanted her for her power, and courtiers who saw her as a means to advancement. The few real friends she had started dying off. People she had known since childhood. People who remembered when she was just Princess Elizabeth instead of Gloriana. And every death made her more isolated, more trapped in the role she'd created. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, and the mask was getting harder to maintain. The performance was becoming exhausting, because while her mind was still sharp, her body was betraying her in ways she could no longer hide. Her hands shook constantly, tremors so bad that writing letters became difficult. Could be the lead poisoning, could be early Parkinson's, could just be age and stress. But she couldn't control it. Courtiers noticed. Ambassadors reported it back to their kings. "The Queen's hands shake terribly," they wrote. "She struggles to hold things steady." Her eyesight was failing. She could barely read without holding documents right up to her face. But she refused to wear glasses in public because it made her look old. So she'd squint and struggle and pretend everything was fine while privately she couldn't see. And her hair, the red hair that had been a trademark that poets had written about that appeared in every portrait, was completely gone. Lost to age and decades of lead poisoning. She wore wigs now, elaborate, towering wigs, some piled 2 feet high and decorated with jewels. They were so heavy they gave her splitting headaches. But she wore them anyway because without them, everyone would see how old she really was. And that's when Elizabeth made a decision that tells you everything about where she was psychologically. She banned all mirrors from her palaces, every single one. Her ladies-in-waiting were forbidden to have mirrors in their rooms. The walls that had once been decorated with looking-glasses were now bare, because Elizabeth couldn't bear to see what she'd become. Couldn't face the gap between Gloriana, eternal, beautiful, perfect, and the reality of Elizabeth Tudor at 65, so she just stopped looking, refused to see, lived in a world where she could pretend the mask was still working. Let me tell you about those final years when denial became Elizabeth's last defence against a truth she couldn't accept. When you ban mirrors from your palace, you're not just avoiding your reflection, you're trying to erase reality itself. And that's where Elizabeth lived in the 1590s, in a carefully constructed fantasy where she was still Gloriana, still beautiful, still young, still powerful. All evidence to the contrary was simply ignored. But reality has a way of asserting itself, doesn't it? You can ban mirrors, but you can't ban other people's eyes. And in those eyes, her courtiers, her ladies, visiting ambassadors, Elizabeth could see the truth reflected back at her. She wasn't fooling anyone anymore. A Venetian ambassador who visited court in 1603, just months before Elizabeth's death, wrote this description. Her face is oblong, fair but wrinkled, her eyes small yet black and pleasant, her nose a little hooked, her lips narrow, her teeth black, a defect the English seem subject to from their too great use of sugar. She wears false hair, and that red. Black teeth, false hair, wrinkled face. This is what people saw when they looked at the Virgin Queen. Not the goddess from the portraits, not the eternal Gloriana. Just an old woman desperately trying to maintain an illusion that had stopped working years ago. But here's the heartbreaking part. Elizabeth knew. Of course she knew. She wasn't delusional. She could feel her body failing, feel her hands shaking, feel the exhaustion that came from simply existing in that rigid costume for another day. She knew the truth. She just couldn't admit it, because admitting it would mean the performance was over. And if the performance was over, what was left? Who was Elizabeth without Gloriana? After 44 years of being the Virgin Queen, of having every aspect of her identity wrapped up in that role, she didn't know how to be anything else. So she kept performing, even as the performance became grotesque, even as it was killing her. The wigs got more elaborate, more jewels, more height, 2 feet tall, these constructions. Imagine the neck strain, the headaches, the weight pressing down on her skull for hours every day. But she wore them because without them, everyone would see her bald head, would see the damage the lead had done, would see the old woman underneath. Her ladies-in-waiting had to help her dress. This process took hours, layer after layer of clothing. The corset laced so tight she couldn't breathe properly. The padding and structure to create the right silhouette, the heavy gowns, the jewels. By the time she was fully dressed, Elizabeth wasn't a person anymore. She was a walking sculpture, a 3-dimensional portrait of Gloriana. And she was exhausted, constantly, bone-deep exhausted. But she couldn't rest, couldn't slow down, because slowing down meant admitting weakness, and weakness meant what? She didn't know. After a lifetime of equating weakness with death, she couldn't imagine what would happen if she stopped fighting. The court around her was changing too. Most of the people who'd been there at the beginning were gone now. Robert Dudley, dead. William Cecil, Lord Berkeley, died in 1598. He'd been her advisor since 1558, for 40 years. Francis Walsingham, her spy master, dead in 1590. The people who'd known her as a young woman, who remembered what she was like before she became Gloriana, were dying off one by one. The new generation of courtiers saw her differently. To them, she'd always been the Virgin Queen, always been old. They didn't remember her as young and vital. They just saw this aging monarch clinging to power, refusing to name a successor, refusing to make way for the future. And Elizabeth felt the shift, felt herself becoming irrelevant, a relic. The world was moving on, and she wouldn't. She'd spent so long building this identity that she literally didn't know how to let go of it. The mood swings got worse. The lid poisoning, the stress, the isolation, all of it was affecting her mentally. She'd have days where she was sharp and commanding and brilliant, and then days where she'd rage at her ladies over nothing. Days where she'd sit silent for hours staring at nothing. Days where she'd laugh at things that weren't funny, unsettling everyone around her. One courtier wrote in his diary, "Her Majesty is much changed from the woman she was, one moment gracious and sweet, the next moment terrifying in her anger. We walk on eggshells, never knowing which queen we shall encounter." And the famous temper, the one that had always been quick but controlled, became unpredictable. She'd lash out physically sometimes. There's a documented incident where she boxed one of her lady's ears so hard the woman's hearing was damaged. Another time she threw a shoe at a courtier who'd annoyed her. These aren't the actions of Gloriana, the perfect virgin queen. These are the actions of a woman who's been holding it together for too long and is starting to fracture. In 1598, something happened that shows you exactly how fragile Elizabeth's mental state had become. Her last remaining close friend from the old days, Catherine Howard, not the executed wife of Henry VIII, but a lady-in-waiting who'd been with Elizabeth for decades, died. And Elizabeth couldn't handle it. She retreated to her chambers, wouldn't see anyone for weeks. When she finally emerged, she'd aged visibly, moved slower, seemed dimmer somehow, like something inside her had broken and she couldn't put it back together. But still, she kept performing, still wore the wigs and the white makeup and the elaborate gowns, still held court, still went through the emotions. Because what else was there? And here's where I need to tell you about the younger generation of courtiers, because they're important to understanding Elizabeth's final years. Specifically, I need to tell you about Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Essex was the stepson of Robert Dudley. Remember, Dudley had married Lettice Knollys. Essex was Lettice's son from her first marriage. He was young, ambitious, charismatic, and handsome. Everything Dudley had been 40 years earlier. And Elizabeth became obsessed with him. It wasn't romantic. Not really. Essex was young enough to be her grandson, but he represented something Elizabeth desperately needed. A connection to the past. He was Dudley's stepson. When she looked at him, she saw echoes of the man she'd loved, and she couldn't let go. She showered Essex with titles and positions he wasn't qualified for, made him a military commander, even though he was reckless and incompetent, forgave him over and over when he made mistakes that should have ended anyone else's career. Because letting go of Essex meant letting go of the last connection to Dudley, and she couldn't do it. Essex, for his part, took advantage, used Elizabeth's favour to advance himself. And when things didn't go his way, he got angry, entitled, disrespectful. In one famous incident, he literally turned his back on Elizabeth during an argument, turned his back on the Queen, an unthinkable insult. Elizabeth slapped him across the face, and Essex, this man she'd elevated, trusted, favoured, reached for his sword, actually reached to draw his sword on the Queen before other courtiers stopped him. Any other person would have been arrested immediately, executed for treason. But Elizabeth couldn't do it. She banished him from court for a while, but she kept calling him back, kept giving him chances, because she couldn't bear to lose this last connection to her past, until 1601, when Essex did something unforgivable. He led a rebellion, tried to march on London with armed supporters, tried to force Elizabeth to meet his demands. It was incompetent and poorly planned, and it failed within hours. But it was still treason. Actual, undeniable treason, and this time Elizabeth had no choice. She had him executed, signed the death warrant on February 25th, 1601. Essex was beheaded at the Tower of London, in the same place where Anne Boleyn and so many others had died. Elizabeth was 67 years old, and she'd just ordered the execution of the last person she'd allowed herself to care about. After that, something in Elizabeth shut down completely. She went through the motions of ruling, attended council meetings, signed documents, but the spark was gone. Courtiers described her as a ghost haunting her own court. She'd lost interest in everything. Food didn't taste right. Music didn't move her. Nothing brought joy anymore, and her health was deteriorating rapidly. The smell that people had noticed for years was getting worse. The swelling in her abdomen was pronounced. She couldn't stand for long periods without pain, her breathing was laboured, everything hurt, but she refused to acknowledge it, refused to see doctors, refused to rest. Because stopping meant admitting the end was coming, and Elizabeth had spent 69 years refusing to surrender to anything. She wasn't about to start now. The autumn of 1602 was particularly brutal. A series of deaths among her remaining friends and ladies sent Elizabeth into a depression so severe that people worried she'd never recover. She stopped eating properly, lost weight, became gaunt and hollow-eyed, and then winter came. January 1603. Elizabeth is 69 years old. She's been queen for 44 years, and her body has finally had enough. The final illness begins with a sore throat. Nothing serious, just discomfort swallowing. But it doesn't get better, it gets worse. The pain intensifies. Her throat swells, eating becomes agony. She can't swallow solid food, can barely manage liquids. And then the fever starts, the confusion, the fear. Because Elizabeth knows, she has to know, that this time is different. This time she's not going to recover. But even then, even at the very end, she makes one last desperate stand against death itself. One final attempt to control something, anything. She refuses to lie down, literally refuses, for weeks. And that refusal, that last act of defiance, becomes the defining moment of her death. Let me tell you about those final weeks, when Elizabeth Tudor fought the only battle she couldn't win. January 1603, Richmond Palace. Elizabeth has stopped wearing the makeup. Just stopped. After 40 years of painting her face white every morning, she tells her ladies she's done. "I am past caring what they see," she reportedly says. "Let them look." Her ladies are horrified. Without the makeup, everyone will see the scars, the damage, the grey, unhealthy skin underneath. But Elizabeth doesn't care anymore. Or maybe she cares too much, and this is her way of finally surrendering to reality. For the first time in decades, people see Elizabeth's actual face, and what they see shocks them. The smallpox scars from 40 years ago are still there, deep pits in her skin. But that's not the worst of it. The lead poisoning has left her face discoloured, patches of grey and yellow where the tissue has been damaged. There are lesions, places where the skin has broken down completely. Her complexion looks dead, like she's already a corpse. One courtier wrote, "Her Majesty's face without the paint is terrible to behold. I wish I'd not seen it." But here's the thing, this act of removing the makeup, it's not surrender. Not really, it's the opposite. It's Elizabeth saying, "I don't need the mask anymore because I'm beyond your judgment now." It's her final act of control. She's going to die on her own terms, and she doesn't need your approval anymore. The eating stops next. Not because she decides to stop, but because swallowing has become impossible. Her throat is so swollen, so painful, that even water burns going down. She can manage sips of broth, some wine, nothing more, and her stomach can't tolerate food anyway. Her abdomen is grotesquely swollen now. She looks 6 months pregnant, this cruel mockery for the Virgin Queen. It's probably fluid accumulation, ascites from organ failure. Her liver and kidneys are shutting down, can't process waste, so fluid backs up into her body cavity. But the symbolism is devastating. After a lifetime of refusing marriage and children, of being the Virgin Queen, her body mocks her with the appearance of pregnancy. It's almost like a final cosmic joke. Her ladies try to feed her, try to get her to eat something, anything, but Elizabeth just shakes her head. "I have no stomach for it," she says. And she doesn't just mean she's not hungry, she means she's done with food, with living, with all of it. But she won't go to bed. This becomes the central drama of Elizabeth's final weeks. Everyone around her, her doctors, her counsel, her ladies, begs her to lie down, to rest in bed, to at least be comfortable while she's dying. And Elizabeth refuses, absolutely, categorically refuses. She sits in chairs instead, propped up with cushions, or she leans against piles of cushions on the floor, half sitting, half lying. Her ladies hold her upright when she doesn't have the strength to support herself. Days pass like this. A week. 2 weeks. "Your Majesty must lie down," her doctors plead. "You need rest." "No," Elizabeth says. "Once I lie in that bed, I shall never rise again." It's not a metaphor. She literally believes that lying down means death. That as long as she stays upright, she's still alive, still fighting, still in control. The bed is surrender, the bed is the end, and Elizabeth Tudor has never surrendered to anything in her life. So she sits, and sits, and sits, while her body deteriorates around her. The fever gets worse. She's burning up, but she's also shivering. Her ladies pile blankets on her, but she can't get warm. The infection, whatever it is overwhelming her compromised immune system, and she starts to slip mentally. The fever, the organ failure, the lead poisoning that's been accumulating for decades. All of it is shutting down her brain. She starts talking to people who aren't there. Her father, Henry VIII, dead for 56 years. She argues with him, tells him she was a good queen, better than he deserved. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, dead before Elizabeth's 3rd birthday. She whispers to her, apologizes for things no one else can hear. "Who's there?" she asks suddenly, staring at the corner of the room where nothing is visible. Her ladies exchange worried glances. "No one, Your Majesty." "Men in black," Elizabeth says, "coming through the walls." She's hallucinating, seeing shadows, ghosts. Whether from the fever or the lead, or just her mind finally breaking under 70 years of trauma, we don't know. But she's not fully present anymore. She's drifting between this world and whatever comes next, but still, she refuses to lie down. Her council is panicking because Elizabeth hasn't named an heir. After 44 years of them begging her to designate a successor, she's never done it. And now she's dying. Clearly dying, and if she dies without naming someone, England could descend into civil war. Catholics will support one claimant, Protestants another. Noble families will fight over the throne. Foreign powers will invade during the chaos. Everything Elizabeth built over 44 years could collapse. They bring her names, James VI of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' son, but Protestant the logical choice. Arabella Stuart, another cousin, also Protestant. Various English nobles. Elizabeth won't respond. Sometimes she seems not to hear them. Sometimes she just shakes her head. Sometimes she stares at them like she doesn't understand what they're saying. Finally, on March 23rd, after weeks of this, after weeks of sitting upright while dying, they get her to make some gesture toward James. The accounts differ on whether she actually spoke his name or just nodded when it was suggested. But it's enough. The succession is secured. And that night Elizabeth finally allows herself to be moved to bed. Or rather, she collapses and can't be kept upright anymore. They carry her to the royal bed, lay her gently on pillows. She's so light now, barely weighs anything. Just skin and bones and that grotesquely swollen abdomen. Her breathing is laboured, irregular, the death rattle starting in her chest. Her Archbishop, John Whitgift, kneels beside her and prays. Her ladies hold her hands, those hands that used to be so beautiful, now just bone and papery skin, shaking with tremors she can't control. Her counsel stands in the corners, already planning the transition to James. already thinking about the future, not the woman dying in front of them. She lasts through the night. As dawn approaches on March 24th, 1603, her breathing becomes more and more shallow, and then, between two breaths, she just stops. Elizabeth Tudor is dead. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the woman who ruled England for 44 years, the woman who turned herself into a myth and paid for it with her humanity. She died at 69 years old. No profound last words, no deathbed confession, no final revelation. She just stopped breathing. And then the cover-up began. The doors are locked immediately, guards posted. Only the most trusted ladies are allowed to remain. The council gives explicit orders. Speak of nothing you see. Nothing, because they have to prepare her body for public viewing. And what they're about to discover cannot be allowed to become public knowledge. They begin to undress her, layer by layer, the heavy gown, the padding, the structure, and finally, the corset. When they unlace that corset, when they peel it away from skin it's been pressed against for decades, they see the damage. The grooves carved into her torso, deep indentations where the boning pressed against ribs, some ribs bent inward, some cracked from the pressure. The makeup comes off in sheets, taking skin with it. What's beneath isn't the face of an old woman, it's worse. Black ulcerated tissue, necrotic flesh from decades of lead eating through her face. One lady vomits and has to be removed from the room. They keep undressing her, and the smell that had been masked by perfumes for years, becomes overwhelming. Something is rotting inside her, an abscess, a tumour, some kind of internal infection that her body couldn't fight. They remove the final layers, and what they find between her legs makes them stop, makes them stare in confusion and horror. The accounts are vague because the ladies who saw it couldn't quite describe what they were seeing. Absent, one says. Malformed, says another. Wrong, says a third. Was it a birth defect? Was it damage from decades of corset pressure? Was it related to the internal infection? Was it evidence of a secret childbirth years ago? We'll never know, because within hours they wrap the body in lead, seal it in a coffin, close it before rigor mortis fully sets. The servants who saw the body are scattered across England, sent to different estates. The doctors who attended her, 3 of them die within a year. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe they knew too much. The funeral is spectacular, propaganda in its finest form, the greatest queen England has ever known. Lying in state, mourned by her people, the Virgin Queen, eternal in death as she was in life. But it's rushed. They want that body underground before questions multiply. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. The Tudor era ends, the Stuart era begins, and the first thing James does, he ensures Elizabeth's tomb stays sealed forever. 400 years later it remains locked. Every request to examine her remains has been denied. Other monarchs have been studied. Henry VII, Charles II. Richard III was dug up from under a parking lot and studied extensively. But not Elizabeth, never Elizabeth. Why? Because whatever's in that coffin would shatter the myth. And the myth, the Virgin Queen, pure and powerful and eternal, is worth more to Britain than the truth ever could be. Elizabeth ruled magnificently. She saved England from Spanish invasion. She presided over a golden age of literature and exploration. She proved that a woman could rule as well as any man. These things are true. But it's also true that England killed her. Slowly, with impossible expectations, with lead-based makeup, with bone-crushing corsets, with the demand that she be perfect every single day for 44 years, with the insistence that she sacrifice her humanity for the crown. And then, when she'd given everything, when she'd literally destroyed herself to maintain the image they demanded, they sealed her body in lead and buried the evidence. The real secret of Westminster Abbey isn't what's in the coffin, it's why we're still not allowed to look. Some truths are too dangerous. Some lies too essential. Some bodies must stay buried so empires can survive. Elizabeth Tudor died in 1603, but Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the myth, she lives forever. Exactly as planned. Exactly as Elizabeth sacrificed herself to create. And now you know the secret that broke her. It wasn't one thing. It wasn't just the Seymour scandal, or Amy's death, or the lead poisoning, or the corset, or losing Robert, or refusing marriage. It was all of it. Every secret layered on top of the last. Every sacrifice, every lie, every mask, every performance. Elizabeth broke herself to become eternal, and she succeeded. The woman died, but the legend lives forever. The question is, was it worth it? That's something only Elizabeth could answer. And she took that answer to her grave, sealed in lead, hidden forever. Just another secret the Virgin Queen will never tell. Westminster Abbey, London. Right now, today, there's a tomb there, magnificent white marble, erected in 1606, 3 years after Elizabeth's death. It shows her lying in state, wearing her crown and royal robes, holding the sceptre and orb. She looks peaceful, eternal, perfect. Thousands of tourists visit it every year. They take pictures, they read the inscription, they marvel at the artistry. They leave thinking they've seen Elizabeth Tudor's final resting place. But here's what they don't see. Beneath that beautiful marble effigy is a lead coffin, sealed, locked, undisturbed for 420 years, and it's going to stay that way. Because in 1603, when they sealed Elizabeth in that lead coffin, they weren't just burying a body. They were burying evidence, protecting a lie, preserving a myth that Britain still needs today. Let me tell you something fascinating. In 2012, archaeologists found the remains of King Richard III under a parking lot in Leicester. Remember that? It was international news. They dug him up, examined him thoroughly, used modern forensics to study his bones, found his scoliosis, analysed his DNA, determined what he ate, how he lived, how he died. They wrote papers about it, made documentaries. The whole world got to see what Richard III really looked like. In 2014, researchers examined the remains of King Alfred the Great's family. Again, thorough modern analysis, DNA testing, facial reconstructions, the works. Henry VII has been examined, Charles II. Even Oliver Cromwell's head, which had a bizarre journey of its own, was studied and analysed, but not Elizabeth. Every single request to examine her remains has been denied. By Westminster Abbey, by the Church of England, by the British government. Everyone with authority over that tomb says the same thing. No, absolutely not. The Queen must rest in peace. Now you might think, well, isn't that respectful? Shouldn't we let the dead rest? And normally I'd agree. But here's the thing. They don't extend that same courtesy to other monarchs. Richard III was dug up without much controversy. Henry VIII's coffin has been opened. Charles VI's remains were examined after his execution. Even Queen Victoria's coffin was documented thoroughly after her death. So why is Elizabeth different? What makes her remains so special that even 400 years later, we can't look? I'll tell you what I think, and I want you to really consider this. Elizabeth Tudor, the person, is dead, but Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the myth. She's still doing work for Britain. She's still valuable. She's still necessary. The legend of the perfect, powerful, eternal Virgin Queen is worth more to British national identity than the truth has ever been. Think about what modern forensics could tell us if they examined Elizabeth's remains. They could determine the extent of lead poisoning from her makeup. They could see the skeletal deformities from the corset. They could analyse whatever physical anomalies the ladies found when they undressed her. They could potentially find evidence of childbirth, or prove definitively that she never bore children. In other words, Modern science could answer questions that have been mysteries for 4 centuries. We could finally know the truth about Arthur Dudley's claims, about the 1561 illness, about what was really wrong with her body. But here's the problem. What if the truth doesn't match the myth? What if forensic examination revealed that the Virgin Queen wasn't quite as virginal as history claims? What if they found evidence that the perfect Gloriana was actually a woman whose body was grotesquely damaged by the standards she maintained? What if the image that's been sold for 400 years, the flawless, eternal, untouchable queen, turns out to be exactly what we've been discussing, a woman who destroyed herself to maintain an impossible illusion? Britain can't afford that. The myth is too valuable. Elizabeth I represents something important to British identity. The idea that Britain once had a golden age, that a woman, a virgin no less, could defeat the Spanish Armada, could preside over Shakespeare and Marlowe and the birth of the British Empire, could be powerful without being masculine, could be strong without being cruel, could be eternal without being human. That story matters. It's taught in schools. It's referenced in politics. It's part of the national story Britain tells itself. And if modern science proved that story was built on the suffering of a real woman who was slowly poisoned and crushed and isolated until she broke,